Hello Australia and welcome to this month's Government Business Skills webinar. I'm Daniel Kim, your host in our still brand new government series aimed at informing, educating and inspiring members of our public sector. It's great to have your company. On the program today we are talking about generational differences in the workplace and how to manage Gen Y, those pesky young Turks, or as I like to think of us, those brilliant, brave, charismatic, witty, intelligent and yes, charming young individuals. And that's not a biased comment at all, not in the slightest. But managers worldwide have been left scratching their heads as to how to manage my generation. And this is particularly true in government, where teams and departments aren't always flexible as they might be in the business world. Well, to help us understand how to get the best out of your Gen Y team members, joining me live in the studio today is our resident team building and leadership development guru, Caryn Walsh from Pure Magic International Business Solutions. Caryn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Daniel.
It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, there's certainly no shortage of material out there when it comes to working with Gen Y. It seems to be a problem everybody's facing.
Yep, I would agree with that. And I think part of the issue is that what are the real issues around Generation Y, and why do some workplaces find it so difficult to work with and motivate Generation Y? So yes, there's lots of different issues around it.
Yep, and as a Gen Y Australian myself, I personally find it really fascinating when these conversations are being had at the water cooler, in the boardrooms, online. But sometimes it just seems to be a case of being misunderstood.
Well, I think there's part of that in that, Daniel, and I think one of the things really, if we're talking about workplaces with different generations, it's about, for example, baby boomers on the one hand and Generation Y on the other. But I think one of the issues is around trying to understand the values of each generation. So, for example, very often people will say to me, the baby boomers will say, you know, Generation Y are disrespectful and lazy and arrogant. Whereas a lot of the Generation Y people will tell me, well, the baby boomers are resident dinosaurs and, you know, kind of the reptiles walking the earth. Yeah. And so you've got this difference between the generations that's really interesting to work with.
No, I've heard that one before, yes, reptilians. Well, yourself, Caryn, you've been coaching a lot of CEOs and people in senior leadership positions. You've been helping them build highly effective teams, high-performing teams. A lot of your own CEOs that you've coached go on to win awards. So yes, you're somebody who knows what they're talking about. You're a psychologist at heart too. You've been around 3 different continents, so this is a topic that's very close to you. But with particular reference to government, because this is a government business skills webinar, you've worked very closely with Australian governments and Fijian governments. Mm-hmm. Yeah, tell us a bit about that.
So, as Daniel says, I work on 3 different continents, which is Africa, Fiji and Australia. And one of the sectors in which we operate is the government sector. And it's a really interesting thing because very often people will say, well, the government sector needs to be dealt with differently to the corporate sector, to the educational sector, for example. But actually, at the end of the day, you know, the real thing, Daniel, is that we're all human beings. We're all kind of similarly motivated. We all want maybe different things, but there's rules around motivating people and influencing people. And so when I go into a different sector, for example, government, whether it's in Fiji or Australia, for example, it's not so much around, obviously I'm thinking about what sector I'm dealing with, but more so what are the issues that the people have and how can I help or my team help those people move forward. But it's interesting because, for example, some of the sectors like the government sector might be with strict and more rigid rules and processes and systems, and sometimes people might say slower to turn.
That's right.
You know, so that they just bring different challenges, really, depending on the sector.
I really agree with what you're saying there, that the people issues transcend the sector issues. That's right. And of course, if you'd like to join our conversation on today's webcast, click the Ask a Question button in the bottom right, and we'll answer your questions at the end of the presentation. For 5 lucky viewers also, Caryn is very kindly offering a free 1-hour strategic review, the details for which are coming up at the end of the webcast. So if you would like to get an external perspective on your own team or department, do stick around. Well, thank you very much, Caryn. It's now over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's really fantastic to have you with me this morning. This particular topic is an interesting one. And when I was talking about Generation Y, I was trying to sort of put it into a title and a presentation that would be really sort of enlightening and informative. So the buff 'em, polish 'em, shine 'em, why Generation Y are like diamonds to your business really looks at what Generation Y does in business today and how we can develop and grow Generation Y, and also how we can actually ensure that Generation Y takes our businesses fruitfully and productively into the future. So what we will talk to about today with regards to this is, let's just look at the generations and make sure we get them right. Talk about challenges for businesses employing different generations today. And that's probably one of the biggest things I do find when I'm working with different organizations. As I said earlier, is that the sort of lack of tolerance of each other in the workplace, paradigm shifts in business, literally over the last 15, 20 years, and how business has changed around the world. You know, what we do now, we didn't do 20 years ago. So very often, most organizations are actually going with the flow with regards to changing their businesses. But some of those that haven't actually changed the ways that they work often go out of business. Talk a little bit about Gen Y's entrepreneurs. There's some really interesting information and statistics around Gen Y in business. And also talk a little bit about the myths about Gen Y at work. And there are a lot of myths around that, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that as I work through the presentation. What works when we talk about how to relate with Generation Y in the workplace? Now, obviously, I could have this discussion about any of the generations, but I think Generation Y is a particularly interesting generation, and particularly also, which I'll explain as I move forward, is Generation Y is actually the future of all of our businesses. So I think that one of the key issues around working with and leading Generation Y is the ability to see them differently, to grow them in development so that they have the capacity to actually take our businesses productively and profitably into the future. 4 tips about how to lead them. I lead Generation Y myself. I have 4 particularly very gifted, actually, Generation Y in my team, and I'll explain a little bit about that as I go through. Leadership styles that work with Generation Y. Now, I'd love to be able to spend more time talking with you about that, but probably won't have the time today, although I will mention 1 or 2. And then obviously what makes them sparkle. And I just wanted to say at the outset today is that I actually did a lot of research on this topic. One of the things, I do a lot of conference speaking, and I was speaking at a Fiji Institute of Accountants conference last year, and I was asked to talk about Generation Y in business. And this is how I came up with this whole concept of buff 'em, polish 'em, shine 'em. Because at the end of the day, they are like diamonds to our business, and we need to see them as diamonds to our business. But the reason why I share this with you today is I actually did a lot of research on this, and some of the stuff that I actually learned as I was doing the research is quite staggering, which I'll explain as we go through. The other thing I just wanted to say as well is that I appreciate, Daniel, that I only have 45 minutes, and this is probably a 450-hour discussion. So I will go through quite quickly, which is not what I like to normally do, but I'd like to get as much information across to you as I possibly can, so bear with me. I think one of the key things is if you are working with Generation Y or if you're leading Generation Y is to really think about what do we need to keep Generation Y. Now, what we also know from a lot of the research is that Generation Y is also the most mobile generation. And what I mean by that is that they are the hardest generation to keep in our businesses. So very often, if we don't provide what it is that they're after, Daniel, they will leave. So we need to start thinking about what are those things we need to keep them and how can we help them grow into productive careers. And obviously, when we're talking about gifted Generation Ys, we're really wanting to help them, get into productive careers in our business, not opposed to our opposition's business. So it's really important we talk about that and how can we encourage our different generations to work together. In fact, out of all the questions when we go into organizations, that would be the most important one. Caryn, I've got these Generation X and Y and baby boomers just don't get along. And there's many things that leaders can do to try and actually make sure that as an organization, it doesn't matter the age, it doesn't matter the gender. The fact is that we're all in this together as an organization, and essentially we play our role, we achieve our goals, and we rock and roll together. So that's a really important question. And then, as Daniel says, I'll give some of the opportunity to have a one-on-one with me over the phone this week sometime. So let's look at Generation Y through fresh eyes. And just a quick thing, I think Daniel actually mentioned, I won't go into this. Obviously, my background is I'm a psychologist. I work internationally, as he said. This is one of the organizations I run. I've been doing this for over 25 years and really love what I do, find it very stimulating. my focus now is really on developing CEOs and senior leaders. And the reason I do it at that level, Daniel, is I think that those are the people who really are responsible for employee engagement, the culture of an organization, and leading it. So I like to try and help them make most impact there. But I also love working with supervisors and people down the line. So pretty easygoing and that sort of thing. One of the CEOs Daniel was referring to, I coached, was awarded the Australian CEO of the Year. So that's really great stuff. And we've won a couple of awards along the way. So this is a little bit about me. And I just think it's important that obviously you know what I'm doing. Not that it's important. I don't need to actually hone in on this and tell you what I've been doing. I really want to tell you how basically this particular presentation can help you today. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Just some of the people that we've been working with. Lots of people, as I've said, in community, corporate, government, education, childcare, lots and lots of different areas, and love them all. So when we move forward now, let's just generally get these generations right so that we understand who we're talking about. So generation, we call them the traditionalists, 1920 to 1945. And those are generally your kind of earlier organizations where you've got the corner stores, you know, the Industrial Revolution came out of, well, these organizations came out of that time, and very different ways, Daniel, of leading businesses at that time. Very often it was autocratic, do it my way, this is the way. What was the Henry Ford thing? You can have any model of Ford you like, or any color you like, as long as it's black. So different ways of leading. And then, of course, you've got the baby boomers. I hate to say that I actually slipped into that but very different way of living, baby boomers. And one of the things I'll talk about as we go into this is that baby boomers, my generation, is about work, 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 work. And then when we retire, when we're 60 or 65, we go on holiday and play. And in my research, as I said earlier, it was really interesting because Generation Y do not do that. They do it very, very differently. So we'll talk about that. Generation X is the sort of 1960s to the early 1980s. And then, of course, you've got Generation Y, generally now between 18 and 32, 33 years of age. And then you can see that obviously there's quite a long distance between baby boomers and Generation Y in terms of decades. But there's no reason why we can't learn to live and work really well together. And then, of course, the Gen Z is the post-millennials who are the younger people today. But, you know, if you're talking about Generation Y, we should also in a couple of years, Daniel and ladies and gentlemen, be talking about Gen Z. Because interestingly enough, Gen Y is going to have to be able to lead and put up with Gen Z. So we kind of just replicate the pattern. So those are the generations. And obviously today we're focusing on Gen Y. So, and what we're talking about is how to engage them in our business. They're young, they're mobile, unbelievably tech savvy, and apparently, this was really interesting that came out of the research, the most well-educated of all the generations. And one of the things I think is interesting around that is that because they're well-educated, there's a really great captive audience that we could use them for then to really help us grow and develop our businesses and make them feel as if they're an important part of the team. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. And ask yourself one of these questions, because I think it's quite important that we think about this. What is the one thing you love about working with Gen Y? And one is the one thing that maybe you struggle or found most difficult about working with Gen Y? And as I just let you think about that for half a minute, I'll give my opinion here. One of the things I love is that they are so smart. So, for example, I could spend 15 to 20 minutes trying to get an app to work or trying to get my smartphone to do something. And then I'll turn around to one of my Gen Y and literally they could do it in the space of about 20 seconds. And I'm thinking, I love that. I love the fact that they're so smart. And one of the things I find most difficult, I think that sometimes I'm thinking about one of my children. I've got 3 children and all Generation Y. And one of the most difficult things I find living with Generation Y, and I'm thinking about my youngest child who's a male, 22, and I was struggling to do something with my phone the other day, and I gave it to him, and he kind of looks heavenwards and goes, "Oh, Mom, really, you've got to get your head around this stuff." And I thought to myself, well, that's a bit cheeky on the one hand, but I think what I found most difficult about working with them is that sometimes I think there's not so much as, we need probably a bit more tolerance around maybe those generations that are not as gifted. So I think that that's one of the things that I really love working with them, and some of the difficulties. And I'm sure you've got your own, ladies and gentlemen, which I'd just like you to think about as we move through the presentation. Now, there's significant research around Gen Y in the workplace. And obviously, as I explained, I did a lot of research, and the studies in North America and Europe look at different aspects of generational difficulties. In other words, how they work well together or how they struggle working together. And it was really interesting that the areas of studies included the importance of compensation, authority, loyalty, and supervisor support and development of, for example, Gen Y. So are they properly compensated? How do they respond to authority? Are they loyal to their companies? And how do they actually feel that they are supported by people who are leading them? So there was a lot of really, really interesting research and studies around Gen Y. And I think it's interesting to actually mention these because it relates to some of the stuff that I'm now going to share with you. An example be that there are not enough Gen Ys. Now, we talk about the aging population in Australia, but the aging population in many countries around the world. But it was only when I actually went through this particular research that I actually realized that we've actually got a problem. And the problem is that there are far fewer Gen Ys than there are, for example, Gen Xs. And obviously, that then means that this becomes a huge organizational issue because it's turning into war. Now, war was a word that was used, and I thought it was an interesting word, but I guess it's more around businesses actually fighting for and claiming those Generation Ys that they see will be valuable to their businesses. And so, for example, a lot of organizations will have, career days, or universities will have career days. Or what they try and do is they try and fast track young people coming out of school and university into their organizations. So they're looking for and they understand the impact that the youth of today will actually make in their businesses. And certainly in the government sector is no different. But it's around then how we actually engage with those generations, why, and what we do with them to keep them in our realm. So, for example, one of the areas that's really scarce is the scarcity of engineering talent in some European countries. And it's really interesting that some of the stuff that I was reading was talking about that some European countries will actually look further afield than Europe to try and find gifted Gen Y to help them. And yet, a lot of the organizations that I've actually spoken to over time and worked in don't necessarily see Generation Y as the answer to a lot of the problems in the future, which is actually a different dichotomy. And I thought that was really interesting, which is even more reason to hold on to those gifted Gen Ys and can grow your business, which I think comes back to Daniel's comment in the beginning, gifted, intelligent, and people who are capable of really helping us run businesses productively and profitably in the future. So there's not enough Gen Ys, and I think that's something we need to consider very strategically in the government sector when we're thinking about what are we going to do in terms of recruitment, induction, and onboarding. So there's lots of issues around. An example would be problem number one is companies don't focus on developing Gen Y. And certainly in some of the government organizations I have worked in, this is not a priority. So Gen Y comes, Gen Y goes, and obviously that's not all government departments, ladies and gentlemen. That would be unfair to say. But I think what I'm saying is that the problem is that many businesses tend to focus on the here and the now. Leaders don't always give thought to Gen Y and how to grow them. And others have a we'll get there approach. An example being a CEO who said to me the other day, I was asking them about, do we have plans for Gen Y? And the response was, and it's a very big organisation, about 10 to 12,000 people, haven't got there yet, Caryn, but we'll get there. And I kind of think that that's a very dangerous approach around Gen Y, because if you think about the information I'm just showing you, if there's a scarcity, we need to really think about it, then we've got to start being more strategic in the way that we recruit, be engaged, and develop Gen Y. Others will say they don't really see the need, which I think is absolutely staggering based on what I'm saying. A couple of organisations say they're too small. One said that to me recently about 2 weeks ago. 150 people thinks, no, they're too small. 150 people, ladies and gentlemen, is not too small. You know, for example, if you're thinking about business succession planning, and obviously Generation Y come into that topic, you know, you could have 15 people, 5 people in an organisation, and business succession planning is important, and so is the recruitment and development of Gen Y. So I think we need to remove that paradigm and think more broadly around what role they do bring to our businesses. But if you don't develop Gen Y and you don't think it's important, the results obviously are that talented Gen Y leave or they seek opportunities elsewhere. And when we talk about the leadership pipeline, which is really important in business succession planning, ultimately critical roles are not kept filled with young people. And then what happens is that your competitors steal your good people. And I could tell you books and books about this. I've seen this time and time again, where if we don't actually think about developing, you know, Generation Y and growing them, they will leave and our competitors will steal them. And ultimately the organisation is more vulnerable. There was a particular organisation that we worked and we were called in to help with, it actually started off with an issue between baby boomers and Gen Y. So we did some mediation and we also helped them come up with a set of rules collectively and collaboratively. We also put them on cross-functional teams where Gen Y were working with baby boomers. And it was really interesting because what then happened was a lot of the Gen Ys are now in senior positions, whereas initially before we actually got into that organisation, they were kind of an afterthought. So one of the key things is that if you don't actually think about them strategically, the results are that they will leave and ultimately your organisation is more vulnerable in the future. Gen Y in business. So I love this, how they roll. And they're so different to, as I said, my generation. As I said earlier, mobile, tech savvy, and actually, interestingly, quite ambitious, which really flies in the face of baby boomers often calling Gen Y lazy. They're not lazy, actually, they're really ambitious, but they want to do it differently. 28% of managerial positions in the States, for example, I couldn't get exactly those in Australia, are held by Gen Y. So that's almost 30% of managerial positions at this stage are held by Gen Y. And I think that's an important thing when you talk about they tend to be confident, they're motivated, and they want work-life balance. And that was one of the things that was interesting in the research. They want much more work-life balance than the baby boomers do. Some of the things which was interesting is that the baby boomers and even Generation X call them the entitlement generation, which is basically I'm entitled to this and I'm entitled to that. And there might be some truth about that, that they might be entitled to opportunities and might be entitled to development. But I think that when they come into a workforce and they have a sense of we're entitled to this and we want this or that, often other generations call them the entitlement generation of wanting things without having worked for it. But this was also interesting is that they're the most highly educated generation of all time. And I thought that was very interesting. And if they're the best educated, but actually what's also interesting, many struggle in poor economic environments. In fact, of all of the generations, the most vulnerable in economic downturns is Generation Y. And they, as I said, they're the most vulnerable. Youth employment is higher than older generation in European markets. I couldn't get this in Australia. 1/5 of under 25s are unemployed. So they roll differently, they are different, and they're most vulnerable when times get tough. Problem 2 with Gen Y is that many businesses don't see their intrinsic value. And I think this is a very big point. As I said when I started today, and this isn't true for all organisations, of course it's not, but for many organisations, there's often issues between different generations, as I said earlier. Gen Y are seen as disrespectful. They're annoying to others because of how they are. And I think what happens then is that young people leave, the talent pool is shallow, and ultimately we don't feed the pipeline, as I said earlier. And so one of the key things, ladies and gentlemen, in the sector, the government sector, or any sector, but we're talking about the government sector today, is to really think about what is it that the Generation Y not only can bring our businesses or our government agencies or departments, but more importantly too, from the other perspective is what do we need to provide Generation Y that will make them want to stay and grow and help us develop the business. So I think it's really important that there's a two-way consideration here. What do we need, but what do they need? And if we are able to then design rules around that, then ultimately we can have a happy marriage. But if we don't, fantastic human capital often walks out the door. And that's a real big problem to agencies or government departments. And so where does the real issue lie? The real issue lies in leadership. executive leadership around not actually valuing or not really having the insight into considering what these younger generations can bring our businesses today. So some of the challenges for businesses employing different generations is obviously to provide a suitable environment for all the generations, which, as I said earlier, can be tricky. Different values across the generations, which is what I said about, Generation Y are seen as lazy, whereas baby boomers are the reptiles that walk the earth. So it's not necessarily, obviously, the truth. It's just different values. Old traditions versus new ideas. And so some people say, well, out with the old and in with the new. I don't agree with that. And the reason I don't is that I think, with the older people, you've got some really great experience and some insight. With the younger generation, you've got lots of enthusiasm and new ideas and tech-savvy way of living. And I think the real thing is in the balance. Hard work versus work-life balance is actually to get the balance right. And the attitudes, as I said earlier, if you're young and lazy versus stop being a dinosaur. So those are some of the challenges that businesses today have. But none of these really are any that need to be unsolvable. They're all solvable if you lead them well and if you've got the rules right for all of the generations. So I apologise, I've actually just gone too quickly there. Just wanted to show you a YouTube, which I think is really interesting around Generation Y. So if we could have that video play, that would be fabulous. Thank you.
Over the past century, the world of work has been dominated by top-down command and control thinking. Workers largely did as they were told. Today, things are different. Millennials don't want to be bossed around. They want to shape their own destiny. And if they can't, they'll move on. So what's the best way to inspire the workforce of tomorrow? Trust and openness are qualities that attract millennials. But bringing these values to the modern office or factory is not easy, particularly for some old-school business leaders.
No matter where in the world, no matter what industry, no matter the size of the company, trust is the foundation for creating a great workplace culture. Being trustworthy, it means leaders and CEOs who tell the truth, who don't equivocate, who are approachable. And for some in the baby boomer generation, who, as I learned how to lead in the militaristic, hierarchical, knowledge is power, we operate on a need-to-know basis, and I'll tell you what you need to know. This high level of transparency, this high level of accessibility doesn't come naturally or easily. And that's why it's hard for some, because it's not how we were socialized into the world of leadership.
More and more bosses are recognising that they need to modernise their corporate cultures and throw off the shackles of the past.
We had something called a corporate day where people were forced to wear suits and ties for one day. They had to turn up at 9, they had to call everybody by the name Mr. and Mrs. and they weren't allowed to look at their social media pages or make personal phone calls. And we just wanted, for one day at Virgin to give people a taste of what, a lot of the world is still run like. And it was a horrible experience for everybody. So I hope that one day most companies will be pleasant places to come into work. People will be able to, if they want to wear a suit, they can wear a suit. If they want to, dress down, they can dress down. If they want to work from home, they should be able to work from home. Hopefully that'll be the world of the future, and that's something that we're working towards, trying to get that more flexibility in the workforce generally.
In the race to win the affections of young talent, executives need to understand that it's not all about money.
I think millennials are known to be more purpose-driven. And so as a company, both internally and externally, we're always communicating what our values are and trying to be true to those things. 2 is creating a creative environment where people can feel really comfortable and frankly at home, where they actually want to hang out after work. I think that inspires a lot of employees to come and do their best work.
Another challenge for bosses is hanging on to their talent, because millennials want development and will move if they don't get it. One answer is to take a creative approach in order to encourage stars to stay longer.
If you present leadership and management as the only track for advancement within your company, that becomes where people focus and obsess. I love everybody in the company being a leader, but we want to acknowledge people in the company that are amazing contributors that don't necessarily have to be managers. You know, if you take a person that's maybe an amazing engineer and maybe a terrible manager, but they're an amazing engineer. So how can we help this person progress through their career as an amazing engineer instead of trying to, you know, if they see the only track is to become a leader or a manager, trying to, like, you know, ram them into a, you know, round peg into a square hole.
If CEOs try and over-control in the old way, the millennials will walk. But if you can harness their ideas, passion and energy, then that can power the future success of the company.
Okay. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you found that was quite interesting. I really enjoy thinking about Generation Y. I think it's always interesting to get somebody like Richard Branson talking about Generation Y, because he's actually got a very firm focus on Generation Y and developing them. So when we talk about paradigm shifts in business, I put this together because I think it was really interesting, and I'm trying to show the differences in generations and what's changed. So with this particular one, you know, me, work hard now, earn and retire much later. Gen Y want to work hard to carve a career that bears fruit now and later. And so what's changed is technology has changed the way we live. We can work anywhere and any time. So I was explaining my team just now. One of my team, Gen Y, lives in London, and the other one of my team lives in Bali. So people can live anywhere. But what's interesting with that is that older generation baby boomers, we work, and then retire. Gen Y, no, they want to work and play, and work and play, and work and play. Nothing wrong, nothing right, nothing good, nothing bad, just different. Older generation, exotic adventures, global travel and spare time, we think is for the super rich only. Generation Y doesn't. They like the bits of travel here and the bits of travel there. Let's live the dream every day, seeing the world one piece at a time. And again, technology has opened the world with increased access to meaningful and often cheaper platforms like Airbnb and Uber. So it's changed the way that generations A travel, see how they want to live and work, and what they do. And for the older generation, money is the main form of wealth. Not so for Gen Y. Time is wealth and their most precious commodity, and they don't want to waste it, which is why they want to go and travel and work and travel and work. And technology, obviously the 21st century, that says increase our personal options, not our personal possessions. And I think that's a really, really important point. I really like this because I was just thinking the other day, the social media generation is here. So there's networking platforms, there's promote yourself platforms, there's email marketing platforms. We think about share my photos platforms, Snapchat, all those kind of platforms. There's meetup platforms, there's marry me platforms, and there's even a it's over, I'm out of here platform. So I actually was speaking to somebody a couple of weeks ago who actually, believe this or not, Gen Y got divorced over the internet. Now, as a baby boomer, I was horrified, but I just feel, well, I've just got to roll with it because what do I know? So when we talk then about Generation Y, they're pushing back against the traditional work barriers in organisations that required slow, staggered career progression. They don't want that, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to people like Zuckerberg, Gen Y is now knows it's possible to spot enormous opportunities to create their own unique paths. And that's a really important point for all of you working in the government, is that if you work with the Generation Y who are part of your teams to help them grow and open up opportunities to create their own unique paths, you will keep them. And I think it's an important point when we think of them that 73% of Gen Y in jobs want to quit to be independent. The top reason is freedom. They don't like getting to work at 9 and leaving at 5 anymore. They want to be able to be flexible to do whatever it is that they want to do. 90% almost say they want to choose when and where to work. And I think that's really interesting. Many more want to work from home at times and come into the office. They want flexi time. They want to be able to do it when they want to do it. 68% of Gen Y surveyed see themselves as entrepreneurs in the next 2 years. But what's interesting in speaking to some of the Gen Y is that they don't see themselves as entrepreneurs if the organizations in which they are working have career paths for them, they feel as if they listen to, developed, and they have the opportunity to contribute. And the myths about Generation Y are many. Disrespectful of authority, they're not actually. They tend to be more challenging of it, though. They're seen as flippant and disloyal to the organization. They're not. They're actually fairly loyal to the organization. They're lazy and narcissistic. As I said, they're the most educated. They're actually hardworking and one of the most ambitious generations, but they get frustrated when they don't feel as if they listen to or there's no development or training for them. And without doubt, identifying and growing emerging talent is the answer to every organization's future concerns. And I think what I'm suggesting then is that when we talk about Gen Y, it's changing our perspective, our attitude as to how we work with them. So the way you lead Gen Y is important, the way you behave around them, the way you treat them, the way you engage with them. Your attitude toward them is critical. And a quick example is I was actually running a team meeting, and it was one of those Skype team meetings because we're all over the world. And my Generation Y in Bali was trying to make a point, and she was getting frustrated because I think she felt we weren't listening. So I said to the rest of the team, hold on a minute. Let's listen to Ash. Ash is her name. Ash, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, have your say. And she was actually trying to make a point about social media and a sales page that's too long on the mobile phone. And when I stopped and took a step back, I actually thought, had I not created space for her in that meeting, we could have missed something that was really vital. And so what we've done is we're actually changing that whole sales page to make it more in line with her recommendations because she was spot on and we missed it. So my attitude towards her and the rest of my team is absolutely critical. This was just a video that we were going to show, but I'm probably not going to show it at this time purely because of time. So bear with me as I move forward into wrapping up the last third of the presentation. Just one thing I wanted to show you with this particular slide. When we talk about organizations, it's really important to understand that organizations comprise two different things at any level. One is tasks and one is relationships. So all of us around the world in any job, we are paid to do a job and do it well. And what are the tasks would be rostering or sales or, typing. But the equally part that's important is the relationships we have. And it's only in the last 10 years that study has been done in the States and the UK that says that having good relationships at work are equally as important as doing the task well. So if you don't focus on both equally, you will never really be a highly performing organization. And for those listening today will know exactly what I'm talking about. You could be in teams where you're kind of getting the job well, but the relationships aren't great. So doing the job and coming to work is actually quite difficult. If you focus on relationships only, you're running a social club. So what we're talking about with Gen Y, and obviously for the whole team, but I'm focusing on Gen Y, is that it's really important that when you're relating with Gen Y at work on relationships, talk to them, show interest in them, try to understand where they're coming from, like the example I gave you with Ash. Value their contribution. Don't criticize their ideas. Make them feel important. Treat them that way and listen to them and give them responsibility. That's one of the key things I suggest with Gen Y, is give them responsibility, make them feel as if they're valued. A lot of the time when I talk to Gen Y, they don't feel valued. They feel as if the older generations disregard them, dismiss them, and don't feel as if their value, their contributions have any weight, and they do. So if we talk about relationships, rethink in business and your government departments how you relate with Gen Y. And with tasks, for example, give them clear directions and outcomes. Invite them to solve problems. Involve them in decision-making. Give them autonomy with clear guidelines. Let them try things their way as long as they produce results. What often happens in organizations, we've got to do it this way and this is the only way. No, Gen Y come with different ideas, so encourage them to be different. On the point of technology, as I said, they're quicker and faster, but they can help your business grow and succeed through technology. They can do so many things for the business. The downside, obviously, is that at times Generation Y feel it's acceptable to be on technology every minute of the day. So there's a lot of issues around that. And what we know then is, I always say, the answer lies in the balance. So the issue of social media is get a balance that, social media for social interaction is only at particular times. If you don't have a rule around that, often you'll find Generation Y are on the, Facebook or Instagram all the time. So have rules around it. That's one of the recommendations. The 4 tips is I emphasize training and personal development. Gen Y rate training and development 3 times higher than they rate money. So put your training program on steroids if you want to retain this group. That's number 1. They want to be trained and upskilled. Encourage collaboration and transparency. So meetings should be open and collaborative. Equal contribution is valued. I often do this. I actually say to my Gen Y, you run the meeting. So I give them the opportunity to step into a leadership role or to run projects. It actually grows their skills and strengths, but makes them feel good. Reconsider the schedule. Think about flexibility. 10 hours times 4 days equals the 3-day weekend. Gen Y love flexibility. And if you're going to do it with parents or new parents, why wouldn't you do it with Gen Y? And focusing on mentoring. Many Gen Y have quit because they did not receive mentoring as promised. So what we always say is get a senior executive who's obviously very experienced and hook them into a tech-savvy Gen Y and grow them. And actually what's interesting is that both the exec and the Gen Y grow together. I don't have the opportunity to talk about servant leadership, but I would encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, is have a look at servant leadership. There's about 7 different styles of leadership. Servant leadership is the latest, and it's about actually the leader serves the people. So in other words, the entire role of the CEO or executive or the leader is to serve those under him, including Gen Y. So have a look at what servant leadership does. When we talk about how to make them really sparkle, create good learning and development opportunities for them. That's key, says the research. Treat them as equals to everybody else. Have a flexible structure with significant mentoring to grow them. Have a fun philosophy, making the workplace enjoyable where a feeling of belonging is strong regardless of age. So one of the things you can do as a quick tip is to create a cross-generational team of baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y. And what you do is you get this team to come up with activities to create some sense of fun and engagement across the organization and let it be run by a Gen Y in collaboration with a baby boomer and get them to work together. Put them on projects where they work together, but the outcome is fun and engagement. It really works very well. There's your cross-functional team, as I said. Autonomy, firm rules and guidelines within which they work. Don't micromanage Gen Y, you'll lose them. In fact, I would suggest obviously don't micromanage any Generation Y, because you don't need to micromanage people if they're competent and capable in their roles, and if they're not, then train them, upskill them to become so, and that includes Gen Y. Decision-making, even though they're young, they are, as I said, they're not stupid. In fact, they're the most educated. And if I come back to my example of Ash, we would have missed a very critical decision that's important for our business if I hadn't allowed her the space to actually contribute. So think about that. They often want to know the question why. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? And it can be really annoying. But it's actually really good to have people who challenge the way we think and challenge the way that we do. And organisations, including government departments, are often organisations that do things the same way and have done for many years. And many of those things might be the great way to do it. But Gen Y say, why don't we change? Why don't we challenge the status quo? So my comment would be engage that, encourage that, because they're here to bring refreshed ideas and approaches to your business. They're savvy, they're globally connected, and they're enthusiastic. And I say harness those attributes and drive them forward. So whatever you do, keep them sparkling. I don't believe that they are part of your future. I say they are the future. So it's about a paradigm shift around the way that you think about Gen Y and what you do with them. So if you want to see how things can be different for your team, your organization, rethink Gen Y, rethink leading them, rethink contributing, upskilling them, growing them. We do various things. We run programs to help emerging leaders, which is often Gen Y. We do coaching, supervision at executive level. We do lots of team development in Australia and internationally, obviously leadership development. And we run a program called Empowering Women to Thrive at Work, which is getting a lot of impetus, comes around gender inequality and obviously the fact that we have a really great gender imbalance, not only in work, but certainly in life overall. So it's a gender equality program. And that's the email address that you can find us and download your free ebook. So we'd be very happy and would love to hear from you. and we would offer you 10% off any 3-day program. And as Daniel was saying, a little diamond for 5 of you today. If you would like me to help you with anything, or if there's anything you'd like to discuss with me, that's how you find us. You can go into that link, and all you do is actually, it's like a calendar, a booking calendar. You just book a time, and then at that time I will give you a call and we'll have a discussion about anything. It could be about Gen Y, it could be about having courageous conversations with difficult people, strategic planning, team development. Unfortunately, we can only do 5, but I'd be very, very happy to help any of you, and very, very privileged to do so. So that's the link. And I really hope that you have benefited from today and that you like what you've heard. You're welcome to go onto the website. There they are. You could contact me directly on info@puremagicbusiness.com.au, or for the women's stuff we do, www.carynwalsh.com.au. So thank you so much, and thank you so much, Daniel, for the opportunity. And any questions, I'm very happy to take them now, if any came through.
That's right. So we will go to questions. And as I said at the start, you can ask a question using the Ask a Question button in the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll get to them as we go. If we do run out of time, we will get back to you offline. We've got a question that's come through from Hayley. It's a really simple one. Can we please get the links to the videos, Caryn?
Yes, you certainly can. I'm presuming we can arrange that, Daniel?
Absolutely.
Yes, I'll be very happy to do that. In fact, what I might ask Daniel is, if possible, if I could have the email addresses of everybody who's here today, and I could send you the whole presentation.
I'm sure we can get you the attendance list.
Perfect. And if that's okay with you, I'm very happy to send it all. So,
Yep. And just while we wait for some other questions to come through, that link again, everybody, is my.timetrade.com/book/714QL in capital letters. QL for quite large, I like to think. I've got a question come through from Rebecca. I am a Gen Y myself, and managing many Gen Xs, it is difficult to keep them motivated. Any tips? So it's a reverse situation here.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point that you talk about the generation above you. One of the key things I find when you're actually managing a generation above you is that I had this situation not that long ago where a baby boomer actually was being led by a Gen Y. And initially there was a lot of resentment about that, because what would they know about this, or how, they're young enough to be my daughter or son.
Yeah.
But I think one of the key things I always say is, first and foremost, and in any generation, but I'm talking to you now, is get an understanding of the people who work for you. So what I would be asking them is spend a bit of one-on-one with them. So what does motivate them? What are they interested in? What are the things that kind of rock their boat, both at work or, for example, on weekends? And I often find in my experience over many years is that if you actually build a relationship with them, that there's some rapport with them and you start to understand them, often I find that it's in the relationship that they start to become more motivated. They want to do more, they want to please you, they want to achieve in their jobs, because they feel as if they're actually being supported by a manager, albeit that the manager's younger than them. So I would find out what makes them motivated, what floats their boat, but also conversely, what doesn't motivate them? Why are they not motivated? So instead of just designing strategies to motivate them, the great question, why aren't they motivated, and how can they be?
Thank you very much. We've got another question that's come through from Carolyn, and it's talking about one of your comments before about... sorry if I come back through. That one's gone away. Sorry, we've got the next question. Anne asks, what is one tip you have to stop me behaving like a mum when managing generations younger that are the same age as my children? I don't believe this type of management does either of us any good. Thanks.
I think it's a really important question. I think one of the things I do, and I've been in this situation many, many times, is I fall back on the rules. So what's our code of conduct? What are the behaviours we expect of each other? What are the goals and what are the outcomes of each role? So, for example, think about them not as somebody who's your child in terms of age, but somebody who's an employee. They have a job to do. They have certain behaviours of which we expect to behave well, to be polite, courteous. And on some level, just remove yourself from the fact that they are as young as your children and come back to the business objectives. So regardless of whatever age they are, what are they supposed to be doing? Why why aren't they doing it? If they're not, then the normal kind of performance discussions need to be had, the normal kind of training and development to upskill them. I think one of the key things we tend to do, and maybe more so as women, and I'm not being genderist here, but what we try and do is that with our younger staff, we want to maybe help and grow and nurture. Nothing wrong with that, ladies and gentlemen, as long as it's done fairly and equitably, and we stick to the rules of the job and the rules of the game. And remember that you're leading them, you're not mothering them. That would be my advice. Take a step back and lead.
Thank you. That other question from Carolyn before, it's gone now, but to the best of my knowledge, it was along the lines of your comment about transparency earlier. In a government department, if you don't exactly have the power to change the rules, but you've got a Gen Y team member who's asking questions about why we do things in a certain way, how effective is it to be able to help explain why and also manage their expectations to say, this is why I can't change it for you right now, but this is why it's been happening?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because I often think that for many, many organisations, government organisations that I work in, we do what we do because we do what we've always done. So we keep doing what we've always done, right? So I would like to see many more challenges of processes and systems and policies. And I guess the thing that I'm going to say now is that it shouldn't just be Generation Y who challenge what we do. It should be any generation, right? And I think if we're talking about leadership, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's all clear communication and engagement and, explaining to your team why we do the things we do and offering or even, inviting suggestions is fantastic. But the more you communicate with them that, this is why we do the things, but I'd really like to have suggestions as to how we can improve it. And by the way, when those suggestions do come in, this is why we can't improve it. I think open, honest, transparent communication with my team, and even if we can't change things, to have that discussion with them, to explain to them why not. That's how, I always say, will your people follow you to the ends of the earth in their minds? Or will your people follow you to the ends of the earth with their hearts? And one of the key things with the heart is people will follow leaders if they feel as if they are communicated with, kept in the loop, valued. Information is shared with them, and there's robust and respectful discussion. So that would be my advice. Robust, respectful discussion regardless of the gender.
Mutual respect. It always works in any workplace, doesn't it?
And relationship in life overall. Doesn't have to be a workplace.
That's
life.
Right. That's right. We are all people at work, after all. Well, that does bring us to the end of the program today. It's all we've got time for. But Caryn Walsh, thank you very much for all your insights.
Thank you, Daniel.
Pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much, and I'm so grateful for being here. And thank you so much for sharing your time with me, ladies and gentlemen. It's been wonderful, and I hope to hear from you.
Caryn Walsh from Pure Magic International Business Solutions, everybody. Do send us your comments as well about today's webcast using the feedback tab beside the slides tab. Give us your thoughts. We'd love to be hearing from you. And also, if you're thinking of running your own webcasts, click the resources button in the bottom right. Grab a copy of the 2018 Redback Report and the Webinar Organiser Handbook. Today's program will be made available for viewing on demand along with those video links, and we will be in touch with all of you with all of those details. Thanks very much for joining us across this great country of ours. Once again, we'll catch you next month on another Redback Business Skills webinar. And until then, goodbye for now.
Bye.